Okay, good afternoon. I'm with Michael Pollack, author of this great new book called Sidewalk Nation, subheading The Life and Law of America's Most Overlooked Resource, which I really found fascinating. I really love this book, and I'm really glad to have Michael on the pod today. So if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, just who you are, where you're coming from, and why we're chatting today, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So, my name is Michael Pollack. I'm a professor of law and the associate dean for faculty development at Cardozo Law School here in New York City. At Cardozo, I teach and write about property law, con law, local governments, and how local institutions in cities and towns work among themselves and with other governments to make decisions that regulate and structure our neighborhoods. So, at the end of the day, what I study is how these governmental processes and the laws that they generate shape our ability to participate in civil society and to flourish as individuals and as communities. And so this book is the next application of that bigger picture mission.
It makes so much sense to me that you would write a book about sidewalks, knowing your background, your CV, and what you're interested in, because the sidewalk seems to be the smallest unit of government that we are able to regulate in a way. Is that something you've thought of before? Or is that sort of your motivation here?
Yeah, I think that's very well put. The one of the things that I always find interesting and tend to write more about is the understudied stuff, right? Um, the forces, the legal forces in our lives that we don't pay as much attention to, and the legal spaces in our lives that we don't pay as much attention to. And I think you're absolutely right. The sidewalk is exactly that. It is, as you said before, the subtitle of the book. It is what I think is our most overlooked resource. Um, but it also, for me at least, is in that sweet spot of, um, you know, small thing, outsized impact, right? And you know, we could talk more about how I got into this, but part of what drew me to it was my own sort of revelation of just how much this impacted my life in ways that I wasn't really appreciating for a very long time. And then, once you start looking at something, you can't stop and you start seeing more and more and more. And suddenly there was a book's worth of stuff to talk about.
I noticed that the book is somewhere almost 300 pages,
Mhm.
probably over 300 pages with notes. And there are a lot of authors I've spoken to on the podcast here. Their book idea comes from a small kernel of observation. It comes from a festering or nagging need to have a conversation about something just so fascinating, a kernel of truth, and then it expands into this really oversized or outsized conversation that you and other authors, but focused on you today, have been able to really communicate effectively. I really like the structure of your book. That's what really drew me into this. It's following along and really the next great entry into these narrative tales of urban space that other authors in the space have worked on, and your entry really. But what I loved most about yours was the two sort of halves of the book. The first part where you talk about four distinct places, states, right? And then you get into the different scales within the state, and how how government interacts with public space, with human interaction. And then the back half, it's sort of your projections, your thoughts, your more abstract topics, or subtopics about managing the sidewalk, governing the sidewalk, selling the sidewalk. Right, this is what you talk about. Saving the sidewalk is your hopeful
Yeah.
last chapter here. So I'm curious as to, was this the first iteration that you had? Did you always know you wanted to tell a story like this about sidewalks, or did it come about after many years of thinking, or many months of thinking?
So the first foray into all this work was, so I'm a law professor. Most of our scholarship is in the form of a law review article, right? So it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 words, published in a journal. Mine is called Sidewalk Government. It's in the Michigan Law Review. Um, and when I was working on that, I at the time thought, okay, this is going to be it, right? This is all I'll have to say. It'll be a solid article. But in the course of writing that article, it was coming more and more apparent to me how much more there was that I couldn't quite fit in the confines of an article. And part of it was just the number of additional issues. So, for example, there's chapters on policing the sidewalk and speaking on the sidewalk, and those were uh, things that I couldn't fit into just an article. But the biggest difference was, the article version, which I very proud of, and folks, if they're interested, want to read that too, go nuts. It's online, available for free, but not a substitute for the book. The book's even better. Um, uh, the article aims to be general, but candidly is very focused on the kinds of big cities that, frankly, I live in and have lived in before. And what I really figured out along the way in working on it was how I might be missing, or probably am missing, a lot of nuance in smaller towns, suburbs, more rural communities. And I got really excited about looking into what are their problems, what are their solutions, how does the sidewalk manifest there, what are they doing with it, do they want to do more, do they want to do less? And so I thought I really need to get out, travel, observe, interview more folks in a wider range of places. Um, and so once I sort of figured out that's what I wanted to do in the book, sort of narrative travelogue format sort of came naturally to as a way to organize those kinds of observations and the kind of information that I was learning. So um, at the same time, I can't not be a law professor, and so along the way there. I'm using these travels as a way, as a window into illustrating or teaching a little bit about a whole slew of areas of law that, I think have underappreciated intersections with sidewalk life and sidewalk policy.
The mechanism of movement of people, right? It seems to be sidewalks, but the mechanism of actually getting these sidewalks in the first place is often legal, as it is construction, as it is maintenance, as it is anything else. And one thing that I've learned in my medium career at this point is, if you ever want to understand or learn why something is the way that it is, even if you're not a lawyer, you're not a trained attorney, you're not a barred law professor, right? The one of the great ways to do it is to try to understand the law or the legislation or the reasoning behind why something is the way that it is. And that's what I took away from your book in particular. It's just there's so many more mechanisms that are preventing and also elaborating or allowing for just a life of a sort of inconspicuous space for a lot of folks that have not thought about the sidewalk to exist. And so I'm just so curious if you can tease a little bit about one legal finding that you learned while researching this book. I don't want you to give away the book, 'cause you got to read the book, but what's something that you learned about the law of the sidewalk that surprised you or that was um new for you to learn while researching?
Well, first, before I answer the question, I just want to say I think you're so right about that bigger picture observation, right? That I think a lot of the time, I often say this to students of mine. There is almost always a reason why something is the way it is. That doesn't mean it's a good reason. Sometimes it's a bad reason. Sometimes it's a outdated or silly reason, or just a reason the values of which you don't agree with. But usually there is a reason, and understanding what that reason is the necessary first step in doing something to make the thing better, or to change it, or to convince others that they should want to change it too. So I think that's absolutely right. As a sort of way to approach a lot of social problems and policy problems, but it certainly is the animating force behind a lot of this book. So, for one example, something that I study and write about, but often think of as very separate from, or had been thinking of as very separate from sidewalks, is zoning law and zoning regulation more broadly. Right. So zoning law is what shapes the things that aren't the road and the sidewalk, what
Mhm.
shapes buildings and, their heights, their densities, their shapes, how close they are to the road, how set back they are from one another. It also shapes what uses can happen. So whether a parcel is allowed to have residential uses or commercial uses, high rises or single family homes, industrial uses, and so on. Whether parking is required and how much parking is required, right? That's a whole set of law that I, as I said, teach and write about. But I hadn't, again, before getting into this, hadn't really been thinking about the interaction between that set of regulation and sidewalks. So my earlier work was very focused on, as you were saying, Sam, sort of who builds it, who takes care of the sidewalk, who maintains it, and all of that. And that is essential and definitely a big part of the book too. But what I found, and it was really in the text in the chapter on Texas and in my visits to Texas where this became very salient to me, that to have an effective sidewalk, to have a walkable community is about far more than the infrastructure for the walking. You also need to plan the rest of the community to make it walkable, to make it attractive and welcoming for walking. Houston, which I write at length about in that chapter, um, you know, well known as being a very car-centric city. I had, friends and colleagues telling me I was going to fly out there and there weren't going to be any sidewalks to see at all. That's not true. Houston has a fairly integrated sidewalk network, especially in downtown and some of its more commercial areas, and the quality is actually pretty good too. It's just, and yet nobody's using it very much. There's not a lot of walking happening, and you know explanations I would hear often had to do with, well, it's really hot and humid and stormy, and that's all part of it. But it's also true in New Orleans, another place I write about in the book, and yet the sidewalks there are much more heavily used. And so it's not about climate, it's a little bit about culture, but a large part of it is that the way that Houston is designed and built makes it not very feasible to walk from place to place. Houston famously will tout that they do not have zoning laws, and in some respect that is true in the sense that if you own a parcel of land, there is no law that dictates whether it can be residential or commercial, for example. But Houston does have a lot of other land use regulations, parking minimums being a major one. Um, and then on top of that set of law and regulation is just a legacy of sort of dysregulation that has created communities and neighborhoods where nothing is sort of planned. And so if you drive your car and park once, it's not really feasible to get out and walk from store to store or to a coffee shop and your house and a bookstore and a bar and a place to eat lunch. Um, it's just not designed for that. And so, though the sidewalks are there, much more is needed to actually make them serve their purposes. And so, thinking about in communities that have arguably excessive zoning regulation, that also can be a hindrance to walkability. Communities that have very little zoning regulation, like Houston, that also can be a hindrance to walkability. And to the use and efficacy of sidewalks. So striking that balance and thinking about, okay, what are we really trying to accomplish here? Because look, and I say this in the book too, I'm not here to tell people you all must have sidewalks in your communities. Everyone ought to be, leading a more walkable, walk-centric lifestyle. That's not the pitch of the book. Rather, it's to say we should think about before we start regulating and building what it is that we want. Because if in a given city or a given community, people don't really want to walk, people would prefer to drive mostly or whatever, that's fine. Maybe then don't invest money in sidewalks that nobody's gonna use and that create more impermeable surface that's gonna be flood prone, that could instead be grass and help us fight climate change, right? We should only be building these things, spending money on them, assigning legal responsibilities if we're gonna use them, and that means making other choices to make them really effective.
It's so interesting. The whole chapter on Houston is such a fantastic perspective. I urge people who are interested in this book to really pay attention on the Houston chapter, which was my favorite, the chapter I learned the most for a couple of reasons. I talk about Houston. I think in the planners, I always think about things in sort of a bell curve kind of way, right? There's like what you're saying. There's no regulation. There's way too much regulation, and there's of course some sort of sweet spot
Yeah.
where as many people get as much of what they want as possible out
Mhm.
of both the built environment and the legal system that text surrounds, builds, discombobulates it, all or however you want to talk about it. And Houston is such an interesting example because while there's no Euclidean zoning code, like you mentioned in the book, and like it's sort of well known across the world that this is a thing, it's the largest city in this country. Without it, four line segments can still make a square. There are still ways to regulate a place like this without the separation of noxious uses or the regulation of space and land use, right? There's lots of ways to do this. And so I don't think this was it. It's not a treatise on whether it's good or bad, which is what I think is really important takeaway from this book. But the thing that really struck me in this, and you may be wondering as a reader why Michael is talking about property tax revenue caps in a book about sidewalks. And I think we'll leave that one sort of shrouded in go read the book. But it's an absolutely fascinating way because the state of Texas, the city of Houston, the Harris County, they're all working toward what seems like separate goals here from a livability perspective and from a legal perspective. They're sort of fighting with one another. Where I will say that there's a $1.2 billion or so annual cap index to some level of inflation, but then the state of Texas also doesn't allow them to increase their property tax rates, their millage rates. But then they're constantly asking for money, and some of this money has to come from somewhere. To some places do want sidewalks in Houston,
Yeah.
right? So there's the absolute square inch on the ground all the way up to the state of Texas, all thinking about space.
Further, it really also goes up to the federal government too, right? Um, a lot of communities, even ones that don't have revenue caps, even ones that can vary their tax rates, um, sidewalks are expensive. Sidewalk expansion is not a cheap thing, and so they're heavily reliant on federal DOT grants, state grants, other competitive grant applications, and so, as you said, people, it turns out, in most places do want more walkability. Um, to the extent that they're gonna start, hopefully, being heard more and more, um, the demand for this revenue is going to increase, and so, I think we need to think carefully at all levels of government about finding the money to fund all of this work, either by expanding revenue sources or by reallocating spending priorities.
Maybe we could call sidewalk people highways, and then the federal
Yeah, exactly.
the federal government
Exactly.
will spend money on
Yeah.
building them. It's another interesting, fact here is I wrote a piece about sidewalks years ago, talking about, we can actually do stuff, and it's time to build sidewalks. This is in the wake of the I-95 collapse
Mhm.
in Philadelphia, where they suspended all of the regulation and the need to do environmental review to just fix a highway. And it turns out the law there that's supposed to be helping us is not actually helping us sometimes here, right? Of course, everything is always correct me if I'm wrong, but everything in law, the answer is always maybe. Um,
That is a great first year law school, insight, yeah.
Excellent. I'm not even a lawyer here. Please do not take any of my advice as law. Any of my my brilliant legal theories as law or example. But the idea of uh I completely lost my train of thought. Oh no, this idea of building sidewalks, right? I wrote this piece a couple years ago, and basically I did a back of the napkin calculation on how much it would cost to build sidewalks everywhere we would need them. That's not a limited access highway, so you wouldn't build a sidewalk on I-95 or on somewhere where pedestrians aren't supposed to be by law and also by design. And the number I came up with was somewhere north of $1 trillion.
Yeah.
Just it's
Sounds right.
about that number. And what did we authorize a couple of years ago to spend on all of our transportation and infrastructure in a bill called the IIJA, the BIL, the IRA? It was about $1 trillion.
Right.
So there is money if we want to spend it on building infrastructure that affects everybody,
Mhm.
right? There are non-drivers that don't use highways necessarily more than a couple times in a given period, and folks who are much more locally oriented that use local roads, but sidewalks really do affect everyone. And beyond the four states that you talk about in your book, all four of which are distinct in their approach from your chapter building perspective. So you got New York, you got Texas, Louisiana, and Colorado.
That's right.
These are four fantastically diverse states in terms of their politics, their location, their geography, their topology.
Mhm. That's
Um,
why I picked them.
and and I think it's absolutely, but there are of course crossover. These
Yeah.
things are not things that are applicable in New York are not necessarily not applicable in Texas or in Louisiana. I'm curious as to if there was a fifth state that that you could think about that you would want to include in the next version of Sidewalk Nation. Maybe you call it Sidewalk World, right? Or if there's another state in there that has interesting parameters to it or interesting legal ramifications to its
Mm.
ability to build sidewalks and zoning and all these different things you talk about. Is there a fifth state?
It's a great question. Sidewalk World, by the way, I'll have to hang on to that if I ever want to do a
You can
international version of the book. Um,
you can have it. It's and no royalty. It's all yours.
um, but in terms of a fifth state, I think California is sort of the obvious, and one of the reasons I didn't do it now is it's so big and unique.
Mhm.
Um, but between Los Angeles and I mean, it's just a very complicated local government in general. I don't know if this has been in the news recently with the mayoral primary there. What folks think of as LA is not really LA. We think of LA County is really what Los Angeles is. The city itself is a much stranger shaped sort of jigsaw puzzle of a municipality. Um, but the driving culture there, the way that homelessness manifests in Los Angeles on Skid Row, for example, is a huge part of sidewalk problems in LA. But also, California has really restrictive, or has for a very long time, has had very restrictive zoning regulation throughout the state. So it's driven a lot of the affordability crisis in places like LA, San Francisco, and elsewhere, Palo Alto, Oakland. But that's been changing. There's slowly been some changes at the state level to try to pull back on some of that regulation. So studying how the evolution of zoning in the medium term, long term, might reshape some of the habits about driving and walking, some of the deployment of sidewalks, I think would be really interesting. Florida also is
Mhm.
another, I think, important place to explore. Similar climate change kind of concerns as in Louisiana. It's part of why I chose Louisiana was for the hurricane flooding, sort of subsidence concerns. Florida, also another low-lying state that has a lot of that, but a very different set of um, demographics, a much older population, especially in Southeast Florida, um, a different set of culture and politics surrounding driving and now surrounding taxation, right? Governor DeSantis is
Mhm.
talking about ending the property tax in Florida. And so seeing how, if that were to happen, how that would change revenue availability for it's all sorts of government priorities, but um, public works in particular, I think would be really interesting. So those would be the next two on my agenda.
Yeah, I love it because you could. I'm not saying you should. I'm saying one could, and maybe you are the right person to do this. Tell a story about every state
Sure.
in terms of because right there's state government quirks across the whole country here, and different upstate, downstate,
Yeah.
inner outer.
I mean, look, I'll
Right, there's this
I'll
can
be
go
the
on and
first to
on and
say,
on.
the book covers primarily 4 states and a total of 12 municipalities, 3 in
Right.
each. There are, tens of thousands of municipalities in
Mhm.
this country, um, and, you know, they're all a little bit different. Their
Mhm.
preferences are different, their needs are different, their ability, revenue, and other and sort of resources are different. Um and so, yeah, at some level, I try to be candid in the book about how everything is different. And so, what I'm talking about is meant to be illustrative, right? At a
Mhm.
sort of high level of generality, not as high as my earlier work, but illustrative at a level of generality. Um, all of that said, though, and you were alluding to this earlier, for all of their differences, there's actually a huge amount that is common across municipalities
Mhm.
in terms of what the challenges are, what the policy approaches look like. That's not to say it's uniform, but there is sort of you can group them into a couple of groups of like I said, challenges, approaches, things like that. And therefore there's a lot that they can learn from each other, and I try to bring that out in the book.
it is fascinating, and I've done work across the country in my career so far, and one thing that's really rung true is what you're saying to an extent where national politics be damned, even state and local politics be damned. You get people in a room and you don't tell other people what color they voted for.
Mhm.
People care about very similar things in their community. They want safety, whatever that means to them, that can be discussed. They want accessibility. They want to be able to get to work, to the doctor, to school, to wherever they want to go, however they want to get there. They want, uh, yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
safety and accessibility, right? Those are two main points that everybody wants, and the challenge is, I think, from a legal and regulation perspective, how do you write regulations that allow both the public, private, and somewhere in between sectors to execute this, right? So it's the irony in my mind is that our zoning code is restrictive and
Mhm.
exclusive, but what people really want is performance and the ability to build instead of saying you can't do this or you can do you can only do this. How about we say you can do anything but this,
Yep.
and then you give localities the opportunity to if we're gonna insist that land use is local
Mhm.
in this country, which is a paramount property, I think, flag that we've posted in the ground in this country. I mean, this is where I think, and I don't want to. I want to get to this. The idea of your Department of
Mhm.
Sidewalks. Can what do you say to something like that? Like, if
Yeah.
how do we challenge Euclid on its face to allow for more uh basically, what I'm saying is I want the Supreme Court to take a look at Euclid and Z and deem exclusionary zoning unconstitutional. I'm saying it here, but
All right. So, so look, I want to
yeah,
say one other thing before I get into that, which is I think people at all levels of government want government to work, right? Or rather, I should say, they want stuff to work, right? They want the roads to work the way they're supposed to. They
yeah,
want their bus line, train line, metro line to work the way it's supposed to. They want their healthcare to work. I mean, we can go beyond the scope of this book, right? They just want people want things to function properly, and I think, um, when anyone, whether it's the private sector or government or any other provider, sort of gets a reputation for not being effective, people lose faith in that provider and say, "Well, it just is going to be ineffective." Period. And I think that's what's happened a lot is, as you were saying before, if you put people in a room and forget about or, erase anything partisan about it, I think that a lot of people, especially on local sort of these sorts of infrastructure issues, want the same thing. Like you were saying, they want safety, accessibility. They want to be able to get where they're going. And that was borne out in a lot of my research, interviewing officials in blue cities, red cities, everything in between. There wasn't really a partisan valence to this. Where there's partisanship comes in where, folks think that big government is bad, right? Is ineffective or stupid. And, in some places that's a fairly deserved reputation, unfortunately. Um, in some places it's not. There are a lot of governments that are doing really amazing jobs with very little resources. Um, but, it's a little understandable why folks think, well, that's not going to work. Let's look someplace else or just give up on the task altogether. I think that's understandable, but a mistake, right? I think rather we need to think about how can we make government more effective at doing the things that uh,
mhm,
at doing things that we want it to do rather than abandon it. We need to make it work better for us. And that's part of what I'm trying to accomplish with this Department of
mhm,
Sidewalks idea. But you want to talk about Euclidean zoning. So I do not think Euclid should be overruled personally. I think um, zoning is important. I think the question is how it is practiced is a policy question and one that many municipalities have been engaging in at a minimum inefficiently or ineffectively, and at worst, also in exclusionary, racially biased, and other sort of nefarious or pernicious kinds of ways. Um, I've written about this at some of my other scholarship earlier. You know, we can through the sort of local democracy pathways that we have available to us, we can try to change local politics and policy around zoning, but that's hard to do in many places where the insiders like the status quo. It's the outsiders who would like to see it changed, and that they don't have a vote in that town or in that city. And so that's why, as I was alluding to with California earlier, at this rethinking at the state level, what zoning policies are permissible inside of the state is sort of the appropriate or necessary level of regulation, so that we can have more statewide uniformity, such that municipalities don't have the same incentive to try to undercut one another or exclude from each other. They just wouldn't be able to. And so there are states that have moved in that direction. Again, not usurping the zoning power out of municipalities, but channeling it and regulating it. California and Oregon, two recent statewide examples of that. Um, that would have a lot of broader benefits that you and I are both sort of alluding to outside of the sidewalk context. But I think to bring it back there, it would also enable municipalities to, and more importantly, the voters and residents in those municipalities, to make a new set of choices about how do we want our community to look, and how do we want to, what do we need to do to make it work effectively, to make it work well, and to prepare for the future. Something else that I encountered a lot in my interviews and observations is, um, many municipalities thinking with some level of excitement and some level of concern about the future, and whether, and that's really important, whether that's the future in terms of changing technology, changing climate, changing populations and density. Places in Texas, for example, are seeing a lot of population growth. That's great for them in many respects, but it's also another challenge to navigate. What are we going to do with all these extra people? Where are they going to live? Where are they going to transport themselves? Our roads can only handle so much. They might be skewing younger. They might be skewing different, with a whole other sets of different preferences, and so they might want to start walking more. Do we have the infrastructure to support that? Do we have the community design to support that? In Louisiana, a lot of focus on flooding. I mean, New Orleans is sinking into the Gulf, um, frighteningly rapidly, and they are very aware of that. It's not just a hurricane and a flooding thing, where that's also a problem. It is just the slow sinking of the city. And so, how do they reshape the sort of urban design in a way to fight the water, fight the change in climate? And while they're doing that, it's sort of natural to think about, what else should we be reimagining? I know that they're doing a lot of consultation with Amsterdam, for example, which is another, below sea level city.
Mhm,
And it's not an accident that Amsterdam, among the ways that it has fought back the water, is with more walkable infrastructure. So,
mhm.
um, I think this sort of forward looking thinking is really important. Cities and towns that are sort of trapped in the past, or their politics and thinking are sort of focused on how things have always been, they're going to have to really adapt. And I think the time is now to start thinking about, how to adapt going forward. And that shouldn't be viewed as a scary thing. That should be viewed as an exciting opportunity to make changes and to really think about, what do we want to do here, and what do we need to change or spend money on or whatever to get to where we're trying to go.
It's absolutely fascinating. I will say is, if I were to come, and I'm not going to because I don't have this in me. If I were to come to Cardozo and you were to be my advisor slash professor, I would spend my entire 3 years trying to convince you and trying to write the right paper to why we should be repealing the decision for Euclid. Just because it's not. I don't know if I necessarily believe it myself, but I think the research into it would be absolutely fascinating. And
And look, there are a range of scholars, from across the political spectrum, who would take that same view, right? A very, both a libertarian perspective and a very sort of left leaning progressive perspective, agree on the problems of zoning as a policy level, as a policy matter rather, and in terms of the rightness of Euclid. Well, I mean, look, the Euclid decision is, um, at its at at bottom, rooted in a lot of bigotry and racism toward, the so-called apartment people. That's sort of the shorthand that my classes tend to develop for what the court is getting at there, right? That, a view of there's people who deserve a certain quality of living and people who don't, and they need to be kept separate from each other so that their experiences won't touch. And that is absolutely at sort of the foundation of what Euclid's sort of original sin um, is and was. Uh, there's no real debate or question about that, I don't think. The question for me is, given that, or maybe despite that, um, does it still serve a valuable function today? And you know, that's certainly debatable. I
Yeah.
would just like to see cities and states do it a little bit differently. But I think that the sort of core of it all makes a certain amount of constitutional sense as well as policy sense.
Look, I agree that it makes constitutional sense. I'm not arguing on its legal merits, Again, not a con law professor. I'm talking to a con law professor, but the logic behind it makes sense to me. There's no arguing the underlying police power that,
Mhm.
given to states, because but ultimately, states could just revoke all the city's charters and be like, we're taking this away from
That's right.
you.
That's right.
Sorry, because cities are not constitutionally guaranteed, my friends.
Exactly.
Even New York City, but it becomes an administrative disaster. Anyway, I don't want to get into this because this is a great area of my interest, Michael. We will talk more about this offline.
Yes.
The great area of interest. I tried to read Gerald Frug, and he's
Mhm.
too smart for me. Did not understand what the hell he was talking about. But listeners, maybe you try and you tell me where I went wrong. But okay, I want to end on the overarching thesis,
Yeah.
which I think runs through your book, which is this Department of Sidewalks. Right? There's a lot of incredible anecdotes and great logical connections in this book that maybe folks wouldn't have thought of without reading it. So really do pick this up and read it. I will leave a link in the bio or in the text below. But talk to me about this Department of Sidewalks. I guess my through line question is, why do we need more government here?
Yeah. So, what a lot of folks may or may not know is that right now, not everywhere, but in most cities and towns across the country, um, the primary caretaker, maintainer, even installer of the sidewalk is not the government at all. It's the person who happens to own the house or the building or the business right next door to the sidewalk. And so, whether that's fixing it when it cracks, when the pavers are uneven, whether it's clearing snow and ice or litter, um, and as I said, sometimes it's even installing it in the first place. That is the financial responsibility, the legal responsibility of the adjacent property owner, not the city. Um, this is a historical artifact. Um, there's really not much of a justification, a ground up justification that I've heard be offered anytime recently, other than A, well, that's how it's always been, and B, it's just easier this way. And I want to say there is something to that, right? It's certainly easier from the government's perspective this way.
Mhm.
They don't have to do it. We do. Um, the snow shoveling, I'll admit, yeah, that's oftentimes people can do that, in front of their home more promptly than the government might, maybe even put it all together more cheaply than the government might be able to. But not always and not everywhere. Um, and when it comes to fixing and maintaining the sidewalk, that can be a very expensive surprise bill that a homeowner might face and not have budgeted for. So, what I'm mostly concerned about is the property owner who doesn't have the resources or the physical ability to care for the sidewalk in the way that the law sort of requires them to, or who just doesn't do it for whatever reason, doesn't do it. And in a big city, especially, but even in small towns, they might not get caught, right? Enforcement might be thin, slow, and even if it's not, enforcement itself has a cost associated with it that might be better spent on actually solving the problem rather than punishing people for not solving it themselves. Anyone who's walked around or worse, tried to get around in a wheelchair or with some other mobility assistance device after a snowstorm knows it's not good enough if most of the sidewalk is shoveled or is cleared of ice. It only works if all of it is.
Mhm.
one inaccessible portion makes the entire journey inaccessible. Um, that patchwork comes from the private responsibility. Whereas if we had government responsibility, there'd be more uniform clearing, just like, by the way, there is of the streets. You know, I it would be, I think, inconceivable for the government to suggest that everyone pitches in to shovel out the street for the however much frontage they have on that street. That's not how we do it. We have government run snowplows, or at least government paid for snowplows that do that for us. But we treat the sidewalk differently. And as I said, largely because historically it was treated differently. That history, of course, from a time before the automobile. Um, and I think deep down, and this goes to our earlier discussion about Euclid too, a sort of maybe unarticulated sense that cars are just more important than people are, or more important than pedestrians are. Um, and I don't think that's true. I don't think cars are unimportant, as we were saying before. I think they're both important. But, something like 1% of most municipal budgets is spent on sidewalks, and something like 11% of trips are taken on sidewalks, with as many as 20 that could be taken that people report they would take if the sidewalks were in better, more accessible, safer condition. That disparity in funding and use, I think, is really striking and really problematic and at the root of a lot of these problems. It also means that communities with less resources have worse sidewalks because they don't have the resources to invest in repairing them and clearing them. But it's perversely those same communities that are also the most reliant on them and on the public transportation that they lead to. And so you end up with a circumstance or, set of interlocking forces that create wealthy neighborhoods with pretty decent sidewalks in pretty decent shape and pretty accessible condition, and not a lot of people using them, and poorer communities which badly need them because the people are reliant on them and they're not in very good shape. And the reason is largely because the finances and who's responsible for it. So that's the biggest reason I think we need sort of more government here. But I want to be clear, I don't want more government in a stupid way. I don't want more government for the sake of it. I want more effective and consolidated government. So this Department of Sidewalks is not just another bureaucracy to throw into the mix of bloated city bureaucracies. Rather, it's a consolidation of what's right now a lot of fragmented responsibility across a whole number of agencies, from DOT to Department of Buildings, Department of Health, Department of Consumer Affairs, Department of homeless outreach or homeless services, police, fire, and plenty more. All of these touch the sidewalk, and sometimes they're complex interactions with one another either create duplicative or inconsistent regulation, or worse, leave gaps, right? Where the Venn diagram doesn't quite overlap and a problem falls through the space between these agencies. And so the Department of Sidewalks would not add to government bureaucracy. It would keep it at worse the same level, maybe even thin it out a little bit by eliminating some duplicative regulators, duplicative oversight, and streamline it, create more of a one stop shop for regulated entities, whether that's personal property owner, homeowners, business owners, vendors who want to use the space, one-stop permitting shop for all of them to make things simpler, but also to create a set of outcomes that are done with more 360 view oversight, rather than each agency with its relatively more narrow perspective or narrow focus. So I want to bring sidewalks out of the hands of private property owners into the hands of government where they can do things at scale with, more efficiently, lower cost at a larger scale, and thin out, frankly, the government bureaucracy that oversees the sidewalk, and to empower a more consolidated, accountable agency that could really do all of the necessary work.
I want to end on a final thought here, and then we're going to let you go. what you're saying is all roads lead to the sidewalk.
All roads lead to the sidewalk. That's exactly right. And, you know, whatever your policy, whatever your particular policy bugaboo is, right? Whether it's you want to fix how we do policing in our cities, you want to fix how we do protest in our cities, you want to see more equitable or accessible access to public transportation or access to resources, to culture, to jobs, whatever. Whether you want to just have more socioeconomic equity in your city, whatever your policy thing is that excites you or frustrates you, there is a sidewalk element to it. And conversely, making the sidewalks work better would help all of those other things, not solve them. It is a sidewalk angle on all those things, but it is a piece of the solution to all of those other problems.
And on that note, let's say happy trails, happy Friday, and great to talk with you, Michael. Anything else you want to plug before we let you go today?
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Sam. Hope everyone picks up and enjoys Sidewalk Nation.
I'm sure they will.